In this second video, we continue our discussion of the measles epidemic of 1875. The next question we ask is, why did an epidemic of measles have such a devastating effect? Here are four possible reasons that historians have explained that might suggest why measles had such a devastating effect not only on the population, but on Fiji's future. The first was that it undermined confidence in Western governance, missions, and medicine. At the time, Western medicine was still being developed, and understandings of diseases were still at their infancy. And so it's no wonder that many Fijians were either suspicious or confused about Western medical advice. In many cases, they referred to their own traditional doctors and traditional herbs and plants that had proven themselves to have healing properties over time. Nonetheless, European officials and newspapers printed highly critical accounts that were derogatory and denigrating of Fijian responses to the epidemic, describing them as ill-informed and not following instructions. Missionaries were also at the forefront of treating diseases and responding to the concerns of indigenous populations. One Catholic priest, Father Rougier, noted that Fijians often referred to hospitals as houses of death, and there was a great suspicion of going to hospitals. Diseases could be associated with curses and black magic, and in many cases, Europeans were blamed for the bringing of measles into the country. We also see that the measles had a great effect on social dislocation. Pause the video now and have a think about what examples of social dislocation you observed during the COVID-19 epidemic. You might recall the panic and confusion during COVID-19, and this certainly was also the case in 1875. Such panic and confusion and sudden instances of death destabilized communities. In some cases, it led to migration, and if you travel around Fijian communities today, you might find old village sites which were abandoned as a result of traumatic events like diseases. In many communities, the mortality rate was so high that feeding themselves, nursing others, or digging graves were almost impossible. On one of our class field trips to the highlands of Viti Levu, we observed an old village site that had been abandoned because of the measles epidemic, and underneath a cave, a number of skeletons which had hastily been placed there because the local villagers did not have the energy or the manpower to bury them in the traditional way. Robert Nicole gives an example from the province of Thakondrove in Vanua Levu, where measles caused havoc as it spread through the southern coast. The villages of Nawi and Naweni were deserted or torched as their inhabitants fled to the bush, hoping to escape the virus. This might explain why certain villages no longer exist, and patterns have been observed in other parts of Fiji as well. They may have also contributed to conflict and wars between neighbouring villages and tribes. When we talk about social dislocation, we also think about the gender dimensions at play. Women suffered as men fell ill or died. In addition to their domestic and fishing duties, attending to the sick or organising bereavement ceremonies, women were expected to go to the plantations to find food. These pressures affected their well-being. A report from Vanua Levu described how many widowed mothers, with their babies weeping around, succumbed one after another to the malignity of an imported European disease until but few are left to tell the tale of woe. That was a quote from the Fiji Times in 1875. Another reason the epidemic had such a devastating effect was that it weakened the chiefly leadership system. Fijian chiefs and village elders were rapidly exposed to the disease because they were the ones at the forefront of the response. As we saw from the example mentioned earlier, when Thakambau arrived in Levuka aboard the Dido, there were a number of interior chiefs there to meet him. And so when they carried those diseases back to the communities, they were often some of the first who died because they were some of the first who contracted the diseases. R.A. Derrick, whose reading is on the Moodle page, argued that when chiefs died, the people lost heart. As he said, quote, "The chiefs were the natural leaders appointed and accepted by the people, to whom the people looked on for example and guidance. They were believed to possess a mana conferring material and spiritual advantages peculiar to men of their status, and when one by one they quietly succumbed, their people lost heart. When they lost heart, the people began to accept death as if it was their fate." End quote. In response to this conventional view of Fijian history, which resonates with conventional views of Pacific history, presenting Pacific Islanders as helpless, we do see a revisionist form of history which challenges this notion. And that's represented by historians like our very own Dr. Robert Nicole, who taught history and politics at USP for many, many years. Robert argues that although the measles epidemic was devastating upon societies, including their chiefs, we can also find examples in the historical record of great strength and resilience. This was an opportunity to adapt, and in some cases, whether the chiefs survived or not, communities were conscious of the contagious nature of the virus and they organized themselves accordingly. Robert noted examples in which churches were converted to hospitals, separate cemeteries were allocated for the measles victims, villages were burnt to avoid the risk of contagion, or moved to suitable new sites. He gave examples from the Rewa Delta, which were low-lying, densely populated areas, where some people abandoned their villages and rebuilt their lives elsewhere. He wrote, quote, "By abandoning their sacred Yavu, the source of their identity, these villages showed their determination to remove themselves from any source of potential contamination." End quote. So we see here a slightly different representation of this event, not simply emphasizing the weakness or the frailty of indigenous Fijian villages, but also their immense strength and resilience in recovering from the disease and responding to it with very little help or support from Western colonial officials. The last point to make about why the epidemic of measles may have had such a devastating effect was that it wasn't the first disease to raise Fiji, and it wasn't the first outbreak of measles that would occur in Fiji. Measles would return in 1903, and Rotuma, a small island to the north of the Fiji group, which was largely safe from the measles epidemic in 1875, eventually contracted it in 1911, where it had a similar effect of almost killing a quarter of the population. So we see time and time again in Fiji a number of diseases, not only measles, recurring and causing devastating impacts upon the population, which have long-lasting effects on the relationships between European colonial groups and both indigenous and migrant groups within the Fiji Islands. This fits into a broader form of scholarship about the Pacific, in which disease has been a key theme, particularly in those who want to understand relationships between European visitors and Indigenous peoples. It's sometimes referred to as the fatal impact theory, the idea that Europeans had a fatal impact upon Indigenous peoples when they first arrived because of the diseases they brought that would kill a large amount of the population. And this was observed in many islands throughout the Pacific, beginning first with Polynesia, where some of those islands were first contacted by Europeans. Some European observers began to speculate around the time of exploration that Indigenous peoples were not robust enough to survive contact with Europeans. And these initial observations evolved or changed over time as they were influenced by ideas of race and science coming out of Europe. And so they began to change this theory to suggest that Indigenous people might be replaced by Europeans as an inevitable process of evolution, where the weak would replace the strong. In the case of Fiji, the weak were portrayed as the natives, a term commonly used by Europeans to refer to Indigenous Fijians, whereas the strong are referred to the Europeans. And this is language that we see in primary sources like newspapers at the time, and also official documents by the colonial officials as they described what impact the disease was having on the local population. It's also very clear in an 1896 report by a royal commission which was created to inquire into the decrease of the native population, or what was referred to as Nalutusombu. I'm including a link here to that report. It's available online. It's quite a long report, but it has many subheadings which you can easily follow, and so you can read it selectively to really get a sense of how the British colonial views of disease and of Indigenous people existed at the time. But you can also see evidence of Indigenous voices within that overwhelmingly colonial document. This is an important historical source, and one that's been used by historian Vicky Luca, who's written quite a bit about the lives of Fijian women based on this source. It's a wonderful example of what historians can do to find countersigns or counter-narratives within sources that are written or created by Europeans with perhaps fairly biased or misleading views. This report emerged 1 year after the measles epidemic, so in response to the epidemic, but its remit was quite wide, and so those investigators tasked with leading the commission interviewed a number of European settlers, but also Indigenous Fijians, to try to understand why the population of Fiji might be decreasing. And in particular, they focused on the lives of women, looking at childbirth and child-rearing practices to make assumptions or suggestions about reasons why the population might be decreasing. So we might discuss that further in the tutorial and look at that document, which is not only online but also in USP's Pacific collection. It is an important document. Although it's written in highly archaic English, it contains important information about early Fiji, and particularly an examination of the attitudes of Indigenous Fijians towards reproductive health and the expectations of work on women during pregnancy and after childbirth. These are topics that don't usually appear in historical records of this period, so it's really interesting for understanding the lives of women and the lives of children in Fiji in this early period. And that's why I'm highlighting it here. And I've also put that link on the Moodle page.